It's Lisa from Been There, Got Out. And I know we did an earlier interview today, and surprise, doing another one. This is more of a pop up one, and this is with a friend of mine, Jim Littlefield-Dalmares. Here he is. Let's hope that I will be able to see. Saying you're unable to join, but let me know because I can't see you if it comes out. It's not working. Okay, you can probably see me, but I can't see you, right?
I can see you.
Okay.
Hey, Lisa.
I can't see you, but I'm going to proceed anyway. So Jim and I met
Okay.
recently in a networking group, and he told me about this amazing podcast that he recently, well, he's like 15 episodes in now at least, but that he started. So before I even get into it, I think people will realize what we have in common when you start talking about this podcast, because the people in your podcast are a huge percentage of our clients. So Jim, why don't you introduce yourself and talk about how you got started on this and what it's about.
Yeah, Lisa, thanks so much for having me on. The podcast is called Seeing Ability, and it was really an outgrowth of I'm working on writing a book for parents of kids with special needs because, I've never met a parent when they were reading What to Expect When You're Expecting, when they were registering for gifts, let's say at Target, that they had a wheelchair or a walker or an adaptive communication device on their list. When life kind of throws you that curveball that you've got a kid who's going to have a different path, you don't really know what to do and you're kind of lost. So the idea was to write a book. And as I was working on the research, my approach to the book is to share my story, but not just my story, to interview a lot of different people and get their stories and get their advice and kind of what they wish they had known, but maybe had to learn the hard way. And as I was having those conversations, people said, this would make a good podcast. And I thought, I don't really know anything about doing a podcast, but I'm going to jump in the deep end and do it
Yeah, and
anyway.
I was saying that I don't, well, actually I kind of do. So my background is in education. And I remember, and I think I told you this too, Jim, when we first talked, that when, as part of education, we had to study special education. And I found a staggering statistic that said that 90% of couples who have children with special needs end up getting divorced. And I've noticed that among our community, and Chris and I, my partner, deal only with high conflict divorce and custody battles and toxic relationships and co-parenting situations, that a huge number of our clients are families who have a child with special needs. Do you notice that among the people that you deal with, that there's also a large number of divorces?
I mean, I think I don't have really statistics as an expert, but I think it definitely, when you think about just the stresses of a relationship period, then you add to that the stresses of parenting, and then you add to that parenting of a kid who has different needs and all the emotions that you process through with that. It makes sense that it puts a lot of extra strain on relationships, and it makes sense that in many cases it's part of what it's not the only thing, but it's part of what puts enough
Yeah.
strain on a relationship that it
And I think
breaks.
about in general, people are a couple and then they have kids and then it's a totally different type of relationship because then you're parents and you have to kind of work together. Are there dynamics in a family that has a child with special needs that you've noticed? And I don't know what you would compare them to, just families without special needs children, but just tell us a little bit about what you've learned regarding the challenges of families with a person with special needs in them.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's probably important for me to say, because people haven't met me, that I'm not really just a researcher or somebody writing on this topic. I have a daughter who was born, she's 23 now, but when she was born, she was 26 weeks and a pound and a half. Spent the first 10 weeks of her life at the NICU. I remember when I had to rush to the hospital to meet my wife. It's an interesting story because it was actually, believe it or not, the first time I didn't go with her to one of her prenatal visits. I had something going on at my work. I worked in the nonprofit world, and we were doing one of those all staff retreats, where you hold hands and sing Kumbaya and you team build. And I was on the committee putting together the skits and all that stuff. And I said, honey, the retreat is tomorrow. Call me when you're done. Well, they called me and I rushed to the hospital. And one of the first things the doctor said was, well, I don't think we'll have to take the baby today. Now, this was in March and she was due in June. So once they said that, I think they kept talking, but I'm not sure I heard anything after that. So to answer your question about what it's like for parents raising kids with special needs, I've done over 80 interviews right now so far for the book that I'm working on, but I also have the perspective of living it myself. And there's just so many extra burdens, you know, even if it's there in the beginning, there's a lot of interaction with the medical community, there's diagnosis, there's surgeries that, like I said, Sophia, my daughter, was in the hospital for the first 10 weeks of her life. So you can imagine the stress that that put on us. The list of stresses that parents face is endless. And, you know, it really varies because you might have a kid who is on the spectrum with autism, or a child with Down syndrome or cerebral palsy. I've met some parents that the thing their kid is challenged with, maybe only 4 people in the United States have. They're very different, but the themes they face are so universal.
I mean, so you talked a bit about the early challenges, like with, you know, with your own daughter's birth. Are there other things along the way, like parenting differences? I feel like in our community, often when there's a child with special needs, whatever the age is, and maybe it's just because we're dealing with high conflict divorce, but the parents have very different views on how the child should be cared for. Do you notice that with the people that you've interviewed as well?
Definitely. I think it definitely comes out. And, you know, you don't want to stereotype, but there are differences in, it's a really emotional thing. So there are differences how men and women handle it and how they communicate about it and how they talk about it. And yeah, I think there, you know, in parenting in general, there's a pretty large spectrum of like that helicopter wants to swoop in and be right by the kid's side every step of the way. And then there's the other end of the spectrum where you kind of throw them in the deep end and let them survive. And I think those parenting differences come out with kids with special needs. It's like, do we focus constantly on trying to fix the problem and deal with what's quote wrong, or do we focus more on their future and empowering them and their possibilities versus their disability? That was kind of the thought behind the name of my podcast, Seeing Ability, because if you take that word disability and you take out the first 3 letters, you're left with the word ability, right? So those differences in parenting, you know, philosophies, if they weren't evident before, they definitely come out. I had to share with you, I was talking with one parent asking them what's the hardest thing about raising kids with special needs. And they said, it's actually the raising kids part. Parenting is just hard in general. It's not so much the special needs, because it's a little naive to think, well, if your kid is born typical, if there is such a thing, that it's going to be an easy path.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And if somebody doesn't have other children, how would they even know what the difference is?
Absolutely. And other children become an issue too that parents face. I'll give you one example. I was talking to a mother. Actually, we just recorded an episode where she's going to be on my podcast this week. And she happens to have evolved from being a parent to actually running an organization that works with spina bifida. But she told me a story. It's actually in her podcast episode. She said her daughter, her other daughter that did not have the disability, went to Santa Claus. They went like to the mall and they did that whole Santa Claus thing. And she went up to Santa Claus and said, he said, what do you want for Christmas this year? And she said, I want to get spina bifida. And it was kind of a shock, but in her mind, spina bifida meant you got to go on special trips with mom and dad. You got stuffed animals. You got all this extra attention. And that episode, as strange as it sounds, was a bell of mindfulness to her of like, gosh, I need to be thinking about the other kids in my family and what their needs are, because a lot of times it just happens to where everything's going to revolve around that kid who has all those doctor visits and therapies and all that stuff. So, you know, that whole family dynamic comes into play as well.
Wow. And that I see is parallel with some of the issues, unfortunately, in the families that we work with, where one person has something going on and then the whole family dynamic changes to focus on that one person's needs, and other people's needs don't get met. And I think sometimes it fosters a sense of codependency of like, I'm going to, like, people growing up learning to put other people's needs first, but it's a totally different, you know, basis.
Yeah, well, and it's not just a cliche. You know, you hear people refer to the flight attendant speech where they say, please put on your own oxygen mask so you can take care of others. That is another real issue that surfaces for, let's be honest, people in general, parents in general, but parents of kids with special needs especially. The last thing they're thinking about is themselves and their own needs and what they're going through. But that lack of taking care of yourself, you know, it makes sense when you think most devices we have, they don't work really well if their battery is not charged, right? They can't do the job that you're wanting them to do. the same thing goes for us as people and as parents. You know, if our battery is low and we're stressed and we don't take care of ourselves, we don't eat well, we don't exercise, we're constantly tired. The reason we're doing that is because it's kind of all hands on deck. We have that fight or flight adrenaline where we want to be there for our kid. But if we neglect our own needs, we're actually ironically not being there for our kid. And we're even teaching them maybe some things that we don't want to see them model if they're lucky enough to grow up
You
to be
know,
parents one
so you're
day.
making me think of a couple of things, and one of them is almost a person's sense of identity. I have some very close friends with kids with special needs, and the kids are now older, but it feels like they never get a break because they feel like they have to be there all the time to take care of these kids because who else is gonna help with that? Do you see that in your community as well?
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think one of the things that I've had a lot of discussions with my people I'm interviewing with, and I hope the book can add some light on, and I know the podcast does, is the idea of building that village and being okay asking for help. You know, one mom told me I had to be okay taking
Mm,
off my Superwoman cape and admitting that I needed help. And when I finally did, I just sat down on the floor and cried and asked a friend, I finally said, can you come over and sweep my floor? You know, because taking care of yourself and asking for help, that dynamic, it really shows
yeah,
itself in this
yeah. I
community.
mean, do you have any ideas for people who are having a really hard time taking off their Superman or Superwoman capes? And again, so many parallels in this
What?
community dealing with high conflict divorce and toxic relationships.
Yeah, it's not an easy topic because here's how it works. When I bring up the topic of self-care to most of the people that I interview, like I said, I've so far done about 80, it's really black or white. Either people are like, yep, I'm really intentional. I watch what I eat, I exercise, I try to get help from my support network. Or other people are like, self-care. I've heard of that. What is that? I don't do too well at that. So, like, I don't do that at all, and they know it. So, in terms of advice, I think it starts with awareness, the idea that you're not being a bad
Mm,
self-care is not selfish. So, you know, putting your own needs and taking care of your mental health. And I think it also, I guess the biggest advice is self-care comes in all different shapes and sizes. I think the biggest advice I get from people is it doesn't have to be a weekend off. It doesn't even have to be a night away. It has to be what's going to help you, right? And what's going to bring you that sense to step away. And like you said, you mentioned the word identity, not having your whole life be tied up in that. Let's be honest, parents in general sometimes suffer from having their own identity versus their identity as a parent,
yeah,
right? You hear people that are like, oh, there's Janie's
right.
mom, as if Janie's mom doesn't have a name, right? Many of us go through that phase if you've had kids where for many years nobody knew your name. They, like in my
Right.
case, they knew you were Peter's dad. They didn't actually know you had a name. So we all struggle with that, finding our identity and staying ourselves in the parenting years. But I think that's where it starts, is realizing that if your whole reason for losing your identity is you have to be there for your kid, realizing unless you take care of yourself, you're not going to be there for your kid. And also, you have to teach your kid how to take care of
Yeah.
themselves one day when you're not
Yeah,
around.
I interviewed a psychologist earlier today, and we said basically the same thing. It's that your goal and your role as a parent has to be on some level uh, to try to help your kid be as independent as possible, if it is possible.
100%. Yeah, that's the goal, is independent as possible. And I think in the world of raising a kid with special needs, it's like not to have your or not to have their identity be all about that, because they are a person with a lot of diverse things. They're not a disability. They're not just a person with a disability. It's a part of who they are,
Yeah.
but it doesn't have to
You know,
define who they are.
as you were talking, I started thinking about the difference. It's almost like if I use the word abuse instead of disability, like hidden disability versus a disability, like a physical disability that people can see. What's it like in your community with parents who have a child where they've been diagnosed with something maybe somewhere on the spectrum, but they look like any other person and it's hard for people to see versus someone whose family member has a physical disability? Do you think there's different challenges for those people?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, because if you roll up in a wheelchair, people know right away you have a disability, and that comes with its own challenges. But if you're in Target and your kid is kind of acting up in a way that seems like just bad behavior, it's hard for those parents to see, have people realize that some of those issues kids face are more invisible. And that's a whole different set of challenges for parents like that. Kids with sensory issues, all kinds of things like that are more subtle and they're not apparent to the eye, but it's just as challenging on a daily basis. There are
Yeah, I
definitely
know a couple of my
differences.
friends have talked about what it's like and how sometimes the world can be very judgmental when they have a child who looks like everyone else's child but is acting out, and they're looked at like if their child is having if their older child is having a tantrum, like it's somehow their fault that their child is out of control. Do you see things like that?
Yeah. Oh, I definitely think it's definitely a challenge, and actually, it's probably going to be one of the chapters in my book, regardless of disability, of like how you learn to navigate the world of people and their reactions to you and your family being different, and their stares, their questions, all that kind of things, their judgment. And it's a process. I think it evolves for most parents. It's really easy in the beginning to be really frustrated with that and really angry with that. Ideally, most people I talk to evolve to a point where they see those interactions as an opportunity to raise awareness and build bridges and draw people in, so they're more comfortable talking about and interacting with persons who are different. And so they kind of see their role as a way to, you don't want that parent who's like, a kid asks a question and their mom's like, oh, don't say that. Instead, you hear parents are like, no, it's okay that they ask. Of course they're curious. They want to know what that
Mhm.
brace is. What's wrong with their leg? Let's bring them in and let's answer those questions, and but you might say, oh, do you want to talk? Joey loves basketball. I see you've got a basketball thing on your shirt. You like basketball too. Like finding those bridges of similarity versus so focused on differences. We're all different. We all have insecurities. We all have quote disabilities. Most of us just don't walk into a room and everybody sees
Exactly,
what they
exactly. There's so many, as you're talking, there's so many parallels. If I just substituted words, it would be really, really similar. So with the podcast and the book, you've done like you keep saying, about 80 interviews. What are some interesting stories that you've heard, or is there anything that could maybe help people in this community, like that could be helpful, or just in general uplifting or interesting?
I mean, I've heard so many, like, yeah, like I said, the one about the daughter asking Santa
Yeah.
Claus, that really stuck out. I think one time I was talking to a mom and she said her life totally changed. I think she caught herself one time. She was a person of faith. She caught herself one time like asking God, could my kid just be normal? And then she kind of caught herself and said, her life totally changed the minute she realized that what she needed to do was accept her kid exactly as he was and love him that way, and then make each day the best day possible. Maybe today's a little bit better than yesterday towards that goal of independence, but not from a standpoint of deficiency or lack or trying to fix something that was wrong. Like totally accepting that they're beautiful just the way they are, but we want them to have as great a life as possible. And that's true for any of our kids, right? We want them to have as great a life as possible. But she said the freedom she got when she let go of trying to fix the problem was life
Yeah, I
changing for
mean,
her.
it's again, like I'm just astonished by the parallels. Like you talk about changing perspective, and I think of the term radical acceptance. It's like there's so much that you can't control. So when you accept it, like everything
Yeah.
changes. It doesn't go away, but it just makes it easier to deal with because you realize, like, I can't do anything about this other than live the best way that we can.
And I think a big lesson early on is not go down the rabbit hole or the cycle of projecting too far in the future. A natural thing that parents of kids with special needs is like think to themselves is, will they have a job? Will they live by themselves? Will they ever get married? And it's easy to think all those kind of thoughts, but what parent has a crystal ball of the future of their kid? I mean, this is not a great story, but I have to admit, I have personally been with a community around a school where my kids went to, where we all cried together at a family whose son committed suicide. And I can tell you, he was a typical kid, and nobody in that family expected that to happen. So we never know the future of our kids, good or bad. And when you have a kid with a disability, it's really easy to think, they won't have this. You have a long list of they will never ever, is what a lot of parents say. There's the never ever list. And if you can just let that go and focus on today and a better tomorrow and each stage, because the other thing is if you get so caught up in that, you miss the beautiful moments, you miss the miracles, and you miss the joy. I was talking to one parent and she said, my child was 4 when they took their first steps, and it was like the Super Bowl, the World Series, the NBA championships. She said, my other 2 kids, to be honest, I can't remember how old they were when they walked. It wasn't as big a deal. But for this kid, it was a bigger deal. So if you're so focused on the worrying about the future, which is natural, but if you can learn to sort of let that go, you
Yeah.
realize the beauty of
Yeah.
what's
Again,
around you.
it's parallels with the earlier interview I did with the guy who happens to be a mindfulness expert. And so basically it sounds like you're talking about mindfulness, being focused on the moment and enjoying it instead of just it goes by and all you're doing is awfulizing about the future.
Yeah, absolutely. It was interesting. I was doing a podcast episode. You said some of the stories, and I asked I do some of my episodes focus on nonprofits doing this work because there's a lot of wonderful nonprofits. And this was a group called Smile on Down Syndrome, Evansville, Indiana. Hey, Smile on Down Syndrome people. They were on the podcast, and I asked them, what do you wish somebody had told you back in the very beginning? And it was really interesting. It was powerful because the one lady said, I wish somebody had told me to stop focusing on the Down syndrome and just love my child for the beautiful child that they were. And the other woman on the podcast said, it's amazing that you say that because when I was in the hospital, there was this girl working at the hospital and I could kind of tell she probably had Down syndrome. And a woman I had never met who happened to be her mother walked into my hospital room and said, we've never met, but I just want to tell you one thing. Love your baby. Love that baby because it doesn't matter about anything else. They are your baby. So it's so powerful that what the one lady wished somebody had told her, the other lady actually got the gift
Wow.
of hearing that
Wow.
advice.
That's amazing. So Jim, you're still looking, tell us what you're looking for, because I said part of why I wanted to have you on here was to get the word out about your book and your podcast.
Yeah, I'm always looking, right now, I'm really just looking to connect to people who are listening to our interview today, nodding their heads and being like, yep, I get it. I'm that kind of parent. I've got a niece, I've got a nephew, I've got a grandchild. I know somebody at my school or my church that's living this path, that's walking this part of this club you never expected to join. That's what I like to refer to it as. And I want to talk to those people. I do interviews all the time. And right now, because I'm still working on the book, every person I talk to has some story or some nugget that's really going to help chapter 3 or whatever it is. And whoever reads the book, then their experience is going to be enriched because I talked to that one person. In some cases, their story is such that I'm like, we need to get you on the podcast. You have such a way of telling your story. I think you could really help our audience. Because for me, the goals of the podcast, there's really 3 that I tell people about. Number 1, it's education. Like if you listen to a guest and they give you one idea that's going to make your life and the life of your kid better, then it's worth it, right? Number 2, it's a little bit of motivation. You know, it's alone. We all can feel disconnected at times. And when you connect to other people and you hear their stories, it gets you motivated to be like, yes, we can do this. I got this. I can do it. So there's that inspiration, motivation. And I think the third goal, which to me is the most powerful, is the idea of community. I want people to listen to this podcast and connect with me to share their stories because I think it's just one more layer of the village. We talk about building your village. And if you don't feel as alone if you hear other people that sort of like you want to turn, in my ideal scenario, somebody listens to my podcast because they're like, these people get me. They understand. They know what I'm going through. And I'm
Yep.
sure it's very similar in your community, right? The issues that families are facing, if they hear someone else and hear their story, they're like, wow,
All the
I thought I was the only one.
time.
And there's somebody out there just like me. Yeah. So what I'm looking for is stories, people to connect with me. They might end up in the podcast. They might end up kind of the books. In many cases, I'm not like calling out a specific person if people are worried about that. It's more the conglomerate of all their ideas together are forming the book. But then probably this is going to live on through a blog, other things that even when the book's written. And then the other thing besides individual stories is, like I said, right now, this is kind of my side gig. I do have a full-time day job, so I'm doing only 2 episodes a month. One is a person or an individual or a family and their story. The other one is a nonprofit, and it's amazing. The nonprofits, whether it's like a therapy center. I just connected recently to a group that takes people out on hikes, even if they're in a wheelchair. I mean, there's so many nonprofits. I had a group on the podcast that a mom, they were going on a field trip for school, and her daughter couldn't really play on the playground with other kids. And like a lot of things in life, what is that Margaret Mead quote? Never underestimate the power of a small group of individuals to change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. She basically said, my kid can't play in the playground. I'm going to raise the money and get a group together and build a playground. And she did. And she started an organization called Kendall and Friends. Hey, Crimson, Kendall and Friends. And I had them on the podcast, and they work with other groups to help them consult and raise money and build adaptive playgrounds or inclusive playgrounds where there's a mix of typically abled kids and kids with challenges. But it was born out of one mom just saying, I want to get something done. I guess I got to do it myself. And it was a nonprofit. So if you know nonprofits doing this work, maybe it's a friend who has a store that employs predominantly people with disabilities, those are great stories for the podcast.
And also, Jim, I want you to note that you're not just looking for parents or adults of children with special needs, right? Didn't you say you also are interested in speaking to people with special needs, like young adults?
Absolutely, yeah, and also, so it's parents of kids with special needs, it's young adults or older adults who grew up as that person with a disability. It's also people who are around that community. So I get a lot of insights from, you think about it, if you're a special education teacher and you've done that for 20 years, you've got a front row seat to the good, bad, and the ugly of this world, right? You've seen what works, and you have those breadcrumbs of the keys to success, or you're a pediatrician, or you're a physical therapist, or an OT. So I think people in healthcare, people in education, or people in nonprofits, I've interviewed a lot of them. They themselves might not be a parent of a kid with a disability, or they themselves aren't a person with a disability, but they're totally in this world, and their insights are super
great to know. And I think also, like you said, siblings of people with disabilities, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And or I've talked to a couple of people where they got into, maybe it was through a nonprofit, some program where they started to employ adults with different styles and different levels of ability. And I'd love their perspective, because it's like, I think having those types of employees also changes the culture in a positive way. Usually the stories are amazing of how it impacts the customers, it impacts the business when they have that diversity of employment. So I'm really looking to talk to just about anybody who hears us talk and says, I need to talk to him. This is my jam. This is my conversation. There's amazing people helping support this world that for the most cases, people didn't plan to be a part of. Now, I will say most cases, because I've met amazing people who signed up for this. They are adopting kids with special needs, knowing full well going in what they're dealing with. And that's a whole kind of special. I actually had a girl, well, she's a young lady now, on my podcast. I met her because I used to work, I did marketing and fundraising for a nonprofit where my daughter Sophia got therapy. I worked there for about a decade, and I met this girl. She was a cheerleader in high school, and they were at a competition, and they ran into our cheering squad that we had at the center called the Firecrackers, of all things. And believe me, the name fit. They ran into the Firecrackers, and it developed kind of a love affair where she started volunteering, getting involved with them, had them come out to their high school and cheer with them, etc. Fast forward, she went to go to school to become a physical therapist and now works at the center. So if that evolution wasn't enough, she then signed up because of her background and her comfort level with this type of kid. She signed up to become a foster parent, and now she's an adoptive parent of kids with disabilities. So going full circle from being a high school cheerleader and running into this little squad to now being a person who every day is a therapist, helping kids, and then now as a mom traveling this journey as well. So she was one of my earlier podcast guests. Her name is
Talk about like the impact. That's incredible. So Jim, how can people get in touch with you? How can they best find you? And I'll put your Instagram handle on our little thing under the video, but what's the best way for them to reach you?
Yeah, for me, maybe it's because I'm an old guy and, I'm not on every single platform. Right now, and also I do this in my spare time. My Facebook page is the primary way to reach me. So I'd love people to check that out. It's just the Seeing Ability Podcast, my Facebook page. And then, if you like what's there, like it, follow it, and then message me there. And that'd be a great way to connect with me to set up an interview. I do most of them via Zoom with people all over the country. So far, I haven't done the world, but I'm sure I will. But definitely right now,
all right.
Well,
all over. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about this. Again, it's incredible, the parallels And especially because this community that we work with has such a high number of families with kids with special needs, I thought it would be really interesting to hear what you're doing because people are always anxious to share their stories. All right, my
Absolutely. Thanks so
pleasure.
much
We'll
for
talk
having me.
soon. Bye.